Yeah. So, does anybody have any questions about anything that we've talked about that you would like to raise before we get started? Going once.
Well,
Going
you mean,
twice.
do I have questions about what we read?
Or anything that we've discussed.
Well, I do have quite a few questions because you told us to actually read Genesis, and I had my bat mitzvah Torah that I was given by Beth Yeshurun in 1965, and then I had my husband's 5 Books of Moses by Stern, which is Hebrew English.
Yes.
And more traditional, with so-and-so begat so-and-so and everything.
Yes. The
And
Stern Chumash, by the way, is not really a translation. It is effectively the rabbinic interpretation of what the text says. So it doesn't mean it's not useful, but just be aware that it's not really a translation.
Which one is that?
The Stern Chumash.
Oh, okay. Well, I do have some questions about stuff I read in each one of them. So,
all right. Well, if you want to raise them tonight, that's fine. If you want to hold off and just send me an email and we'll cover it.
No, I don't really. Should I go ahead and start asking you?
Well, give me one for starters.
Okay. Well, one where it says that the women were beautiful and the divine beings wanted to devour them, and so God didn't like that. And I'm like, what is that all about?
Yes. The short answer to that is I don't know. The long answer is that clearly some mythological elements found their way into different parts of the creation story and the generations that followed. And this is just one example of that.
Yeah, I think so. When man began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and they took them as wives any they liked.
Yeah.
And
that sounds like something right out of a mythology book.
It does, doesn't it? It's Genesis 6.
Yes.
And then
right before the Noah story.
Yeah.
And it may give you, an additional insight as to why God thinks that the generation is so perverted. Okay? If anything like that is actually physically happening and not just total mythology, then what it's saying is that the powerful take who they want. Yet another reason why God would say, this is this is why I regret making human beings.
And then the other thing in this particular book that I thought was interesting is that, it was called Babel because the Lord confounded the speech of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. But I don't see, I guess, the way it's described here, it doesn't sound like they were doing anything that horrible. They were just trying to be united and speak the same language.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that
this was an attempt to explain how, if God created a small group of people, how they got scattered all around the earth.
Yeah, right? That's what I thought too.
And it also places them in this situation. It makes them appear to be arrogant, right? As if they are trying to overcome the heavens. They're creating this tower through which they will be like gods. And God says, well, I'll fix that.
Well, right? It didn't really imply that in what I was reading.
Well, that's generally how the story is interpreted, but I think again, it's one of those things that's really necessary. I mean, you have to have an explanation for how human beings wind up all over the earth. Right? Now, they didn't have the explanation that modern science has, which is we've uncovered these skeletons that are millions of years old. And we've uncovered other skeletons. So we know that human beings actually evolved out of an earlier form of man. Right? They didn't have that.
Well,
They
and
didn't know that.
also when there were too many people in one area, they used up the resources, so they had to go someplace else. And when they went other places over time, they formed their own dialect. And it slowly became, first of all, it was all verbal, so it was easy to change the language. Nothing was codified.
Yeah, that's correct. But again, that's not something that the author or authors of the Torah understood. And so they came up with an explanation, which, while the explanation is clearly not exactly how it was, the explanation gave people an ethical lesson as well as an explanation. The ethical lesson is don't try to be like God. Imitate God's qualities, but don't try to be a God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then one last thing is, it talks about when Abraham and Lot, his brother's son, and everybody is leaving, and they're going into Canaan, that they take all the persons that they had obtained in Haran.
Yeah.
In other words, they're slaves.
Either they are slaves or they are indentured servants, or, the way the rabbis of old interpreted it was these are people who voluntarily joined together with Abraham and Sarah because Abraham and Sarah had, in effect, converted them to their way of understanding God. All the souls that they had made, meaning the souls that they had kind of overhauled through their understanding of religion. It's probably more like these are people who are indentured servants to Abraham and Sarah. They head out with a certain amount of wealth. They make some more wealth in Canaan. And yeah, they have plenty of servants, but maybe not like slavery at least existed in the way that we know of it in other places and in other times.
Maybe. Probably.
Okay, anyone else have questions before we get rolling on tonight's material? All right, hearing none, let's go into our text, right? We are up to chapter 22 of Genesis, which is called Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. God asks Abraham to take his son, probably at a fairly young age, to Mount Moriah, where Abraham will sacrifice him. Now, in that time, human sacrifice was pretty common. So even though God has made all sorts of promises about descendants and, your descendants will be like the grains of sand on the shore and so forth, Abraham complies. Interestingly, both chapter 12, which is the beginning of the Abraham story, and chapter 22, the binding of Isaac, both begin with God saying to him, Lech lecha, go forth, as if to say that this trial with the binding of Isaac is somehow connected with the first challenge God gives Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a new place. And so I suspect everybody here knows at the last moment, the angel intervenes, an angel, right? Intervenes and says, here's a ram, sacrifice that instead. God doesn't want you to do human sacrifice. No more. Now, maybe you can say Abraham should have challenged God in the first place, right? But he doesn't. Why doesn't he argue or bargain when God asks him to sacrifice his son? It's not logical that he doesn't challenge God. But in order to make the key point, the story requires that he be prepared to carry it out. And that point is, God does not want human sacrifice. Now, the story praises him for being a man of faith and being prepared to go through with it, but it clearly says no more. And this is, it later becomes one of the 613 commandments. Do not allow any of your offspring to be offered up to Molech, right? To a false god. That's Leviticus 18:21, right? Now, this term Akedah, as in the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, was later used to refer to times when Jews themselves were persecuted, were threatened with their lives if they refused to convert, particularly during the Crusades. And of course, there have been many other times when Jews were threatened, irrespective of their willingness to convert, and often even after they did convert. Telushkin emphasizes the fact that many Westerners read this story through Christian eyes, because when they think about a sacrifice, they think about Jesus, who was sacrificed for the sins of the people. But the real lesson here is that God does not want any kind of human sacrifice. And that lesson had to be conveyed because it was so common in ancient times. If you wanted the favor of the gods, you wanted a good harvest, you gave up something, or more likely someone, in order to get it. And Telushkin cites the example mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, where the king of Moab, was fighting a war with Israel, sacrifices his firstborn son, who was supposed to be a successor. Now, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So the need to eliminate human sacrifice, and this, Moab is much later. This is, 2 Kings. So you're talking about only about 1900 years ago, which is way over 1,000 years after Abraham, right? So if it was something that was practiced 2,900 years ago, clearly it was, practiced 1,000 years before that, right? So there had to be a radical experience in the family of Abraham, in the story of Abraham, and that's what this is. That story is required in order to make it clear that God does not want human sacrifice. Right? Telushkin also writes about one of the most famous Christian treatments of the story in the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard was very popular when I was in college, and I read Kierkegaard in college. I'm not so sure he's that popular anymore, but I do recommend you read what Telushkin says about this on page 18, which will add to your understanding. Telushkin also treats the question of where was Sarah in all this? Where is the kid's mother, right? And he cites some evidence that she actually separates from Abraham because of this. But it is also suggested that she dies as soon as she learns of it, because the very next chapter of the Torah tells us of her death and burial.
Mm.
Okay. Okay, comments or questions up to here? And you probably should have questions about the binding of Isaac, but you're welcome to hold them and send them to me later. Okay. All right. The next story deals with is the next generation. Isaac gets a wife. The wife is Rebecca. And eventually, after, again, another period of infertility, Rebecca has twin sons. Right? And they are wrestling within her as a kind of foreshadowing of the struggle that's going to come between the two of them. Okay? And there is Esau, who is the firstborn, who becomes kind of a hunter, and he loves to go out and kill animals and bring home the meat, because that's what his father likes, and that's really what he likes. Okay? The other one is Jacob. Esau is born first, but Jacob comes out holding on to his brother's heel. Hence the name Yaakov comes from Akev, heel. It's also been said that Jacob is a little bit of a heel in his own right, but we're getting to that. Okay? And so normally the firstborn gets all the goodies, okay? Inherits everything in that time anyway. But Jacob and his mother have this scheme whereby they will deceive Isaac, the father, who is now older and blind. They will deceive him into thinking that Jacob is actually Esau. And so Jacob will bring the food carefully prepared by his mother, and he will have, hairy skins, animal skins, which will sort of approximate, the feeling of, the hairy arms apparently that Esau had. Right? And Isaac is a little doubtful about this because, you can tell their voices apart. And also it's been suggested that Jacob, even if his voice sounds like his brother, he doesn't talk like his brother. His talk is, a little less crazy, a little less of a hunter type. If you are the kind of guy who hangs out in the pool hall, you pick up a certain repertoire of language. If you're the kind of guy who goes to night school to better himself, you pick up a different kind of vocabulary. So we're not sure exactly what Isaac means by this, but the verse that is famous and is cited by Telushkin here is the verse when Jacob brings this offering for his father and asks for the blessing, Isaac says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Now, are you really Esau? And he says, I am. He's a real heel, right? That's Jacob for you, right? Now, Jacob is not the hunter in the family. Jacob is the homeboy, right? It's not totally clear that Isaac is really convinced that the son in front of him is Esau. As Telushkin himself indicates, the fact that Isaac is not willing to withdraw this blessing suggests that on some level, maybe an unconscious level or maybe not, he knows that Jacob is the better of the two sons and the more fitting to receive the blessing as the spiritual leader of the family. So after this episode, guess who's really mad? Esau is furious and he says,
Yeah.
I'm going to kill Jacob. And mom says, I think it's time for Jacob to go away for a while. And she sends him to live with her father, right? And, or rather her brother, Lavan. And Lavan happens to have two daughters. And Jacob falls in love with the younger one, Rachel, at first sight. Okay, it's terrific. He's ready to marry her, and Lavan says, you know, you got to work for what you're going to get. Okay, so give me 7 years worth of labor, and then you can marry Rachel. And Jacob says, wow, that's a hard bargain, but okay. You know, love conquers all, and that's great. And what happens at the wedding? Lavan, I guess, you know, women were pretty well covered up at the wedding, as is true in many Oriental countries today. It's not until after the marriage has been consummated that he realizes that Lavan has pulled a fast one on him and substituted the older daughter, Leah, right, for Rachel. Jacob wakes up in the morning and he finds that he's not with Rachel. I mean, it was dark in there, right? So he doesn't know, but in the morning he knows, and he runs off to Lavan. And Lavan says, well, this is not the way we do things here. We don't give away the younger before the older. This is an example of how the Bible teaches measure for measure, right? Because after all, look what happened. Look what Jacob did to Esau. Kind of sneaky, huh? But don't worry, because he's going to get his comeuppance here. And Lavan says, you know what? You'll work for me for another 7 years. Give this one her week of celebration with you, and then you can marry Rachel too, but you'll stay with me for another 7 years. Jacob probably is not thrilled with the way this came out, but what choice does he have? So he says, okay, we'll do it that way. And, this is how it turns out, that Jacob has 2 wives, and as fertility goes, Jacob eventually has children with their 2 handmaidens, Zilpah and Bilhah, right? And so through them, he has 12 sons, right? And 1 daughter that we know of, right? Jacob, after all this, after 14 years of working for his father-in-law and a number of years of, trying to build his own fortune there, which, when you're dealing with sheep, fortunes don't necessarily come easily, but with a little help, he makes his way, and then he decides that it's time to leave. He's had enough of dealing with his father-in-law, and he's going to go back home, right? But what happens as he gets close to home? He starts wondering, wow, how's Esau feeling about me these days? Wonder how that's going to come down. He's a little nervous about that. And so he sort of separates, his wives and children into 2 different camps, so that if he's with one, the other one won't be in danger in case Esau gets violent. And the night before all of this, Jacob has an encounter with someone or something, an angel, a being of some kind, Maybe it was just a dream sequence. We don't know, right? But he is wrestling with this, what he believes to be an angel. And at daybreak, he said, the angel says, "Let me go," because it's daytime. I mean, this event has gone on long enough. And Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Right? And so the angel blesses him and gives him a new name. Right? Jacob becomes Yisrael, Israel. Israel meaning he who wrestles with God. Right? Suggesting that this being that he wrestled with was somehow a divine force or an angel sent from God. Whatever it is, right? It's very mysterious, but it tells you something about what the Jewish people are supposed to be. We are supposed to wrestle with God. The name of Islam means submission. That's what Islam is all about, is submission to Allah, right? And to the way of the Prophet. Christianity is much more about pure faith. Faith is what conquers everything. Judaism is about struggling with God, wrestling with God, struggling with what it is that God wants us to do in all kinds of situations. And so this is where the term the children of Israel comes from, right? And of course, we already saw Abraham wrestling with God, bargaining with God over the inhabitants of Sodom. And even though it didn't work out the way he wanted it to, because there weren't really any righteous people in Sodom, nonetheless, God doesn't say, Abraham, shut up. Right? He doesn't say, Abraham, you have no right to ask for that. Actually, the sense of it is we have every right to hold God to his promises to the Jewish people. All right. So we now have 2 wives, 2 handmaidens, and 12 sons. And by the way, everything goes okay with Jacob and Esau and their reunion. They hug each other. But, they decide maybe it's best if they don't live together. Get out while the going's good, right? So Jacob goes one way and Esau goes another, and it seems to work out okay, but there's no record of them getting together again until they come to bury their ancestors. Right? So now the story focuses on the 11th son, the older son of Rachel, and that is Joseph. Joseph is the favorite son because, number one, he's the son of the favorite wife. And number two, Benjamin isn't likely to be the favorite. He's the other son of Rachel, but Rachel dies giving birth to him. So there's like, oh, right? You don't have the same thing. There's also a very strong resemblance between Mother Rachel and son Joseph. They are described in exactly the same words, except that, for her it's feminine form and for him it's masculine form. For her, she said she is Yafat Toar Vifat Maria, beautiful of form and beautiful of appearance. And he is Yafei Toar Vifei Maria, the same thing, except basically what it says, he's well built and handsome. Okay, so yeah, and with Rachel dead, there's nobody to tell Jacob that treating Joseph better than all the other children is really not a good idea. So he displays this favoritism in many ways. He gives him this fabulous coat of many colors. Um, and Joseph is a great dreamer, right? He dreams that eventually all of his brothers and his mother and father will bow down to him, which is, by the way, if you have brothers and sisters, don't tell them that. Right? It's a bad idea. I mean, those of you who have had experienced a little sibling rivalry, either with your siblings or your children, you understand, right? It's not a good idea. And then, he also kind of tattles on his brothers. Like if they're doing something wrong, he will go home and tell Jacob exactly what he saw and heard. Also not the best way to make friends with your siblings, right? And so, and by the way, it's also possible that Jacob, consciously or otherwise, encourages Joseph to be like Rachel and even look a little like Rachel. And maybe that's why he gives her this fancy coat. He gives him the fancy coat. But it's not going to impress his brothers. And so, and in fact, it's not clear that Joseph really appreciated being treated as the favorite in the long run, because when he winds up in Egypt, after his brothers sell him into slavery, he's there for 22 years. He becomes the assistant to the Pharaoh, and he never tries to contact his father, right? So the brothers are clearly no angels, right? I mean, who sells their little brother into slavery and then lies to their father about it? But this is how the story turns out. And so Joseph may have a little bit of ambivalence toward his father and maybe have acquired some understanding about exactly how, things wound up the way they did and, what his father did to him. So Joseph is enslaved in Egypt. He suddenly grows up. He becomes a man of principle. He resists the seduction of his master's wife, and he pays for that by being put in prison. Now, Telushkin rightly suggests that his master probably knows that his wife was lying and accusing Joseph of raping her. Okay? But he's got to do something, and it's not worth tearing up his family over him. So he has Joseph put into prison. And eventually, because Joseph becomes known as someone who can interpret dreams, there's that skill of his again, he is freed and he is elevated to become the second to Pharaoh. Because of Pharaoh's dreams, he's able to predict that there's going to be a famine, and he suggests to Pharaoh exactly how to deal with the famine. And that's what, and that, he's elevated to this high position. Eventually, he is reconciled with his brothers, who have outgrown their distaste for their little brother, and they repent for what they did to him. Telushkin points out how interesting it is that Genesis deals with 4 sets of brothers, right? You have Cain and Abel, you have Isaac and Ishmael, you have Jacob and Esau, and you have Joseph and his brothers. And there is some progression here, right? You start with murder, right? And then things get a little better, and then they get a little better still, and eventually, with the brothers of Joseph and Joseph, they reconcile, and they are, at least, I don't know if Joseph ever completely trusts them, but he knows that they are sorry for what they did, and he accepts them, and they accept him. So, the key point here is that the Jewish family, like the human family, begins with problems and with serious dysfunction, and some of which is never completely resolved, right? I'm not sure if we're all from dysfunctional families. I mean, everyone in my family was from a dysfunctional family, so, why not? But the question is how you deal with that and how you overcome it. Okay? So let's stop here. And if anybody has any questions, we'll take them now. Yes, Suzanne.
You mentioned in the beginning of the class about Christian beliefs on this story or these stories. Is the Christian teaching a little bit different? How do they interpret up to this point? You talk about families struggling. That doesn't seem to be part of what Christianity proposes.
Yeah, it doesn't fit the narrative of Christianity. And frankly, I think that, most of the stories of Genesis, other than the Garden of Eden, are rarely spoken about in church, right? They're taught in Sunday school, but they're rarely focused on with any depth. So for instance, in the Christian way, what's great about Joseph is that he forgives his brothers, right? Forgiveness is a great virtue in Christianity. The reality is that Joseph doesn't forgive them until he sees that they are sorry for what they did, right? And then he can forgive them. And even then, I mean, he has gained the perspective that it was part of God's plan, which maybe it was, right? That still doesn't provide an excuse for what they did, right? But only after he sees that they are sorry for what they had done, does he actually forgive them. And there are several chapters where he's testing them and he does not forgive them right away, right? So again, that doesn't fit the Christian narrative. I mean, you can give other examples of this, but I think that's enough on this point. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, then let's go back. Okay, so there were 12 sons, which meant that there are 12 tribes eventually in the Israelite people. 6 of them from Leah, 2 from Rachel, 2 from each of their handmaidens, Bilhah and Zilpah. Well, eventually what happens to the 12 tribes is that the Israelite kingdom splits into 2 during the reign of King Solomon's son, Nehemiah. And several centuries later, in 722 BCE, the northern kingdom is conquered by Assyria, and they are gone. They are mostly taken into exile. Few of them may have wound up in the southern kingdom, but otherwise, they go off into exile, they assimilate into their surroundings, and they are lost to the Jewish people. Various individuals have tried to suggest where the 10 lost tribes turned up. The reality is that they just ceased to exist and are never heard from again. Now to the Exodus, or the book of Exodus, and Moses. All right? God chooses Moses to confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of slavery. So the basics of the story you can read in the first several chapters, and you should read first several chapters of the book of Exodus. Just a brief run through of the basic facts. In the generations after Joseph, a later Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites. And at a certain point, the Pharaoh decrees that all the Jewish male babies will be killed. When Moses is born, his mother puts him in a little raft and sends him down the Nile, hoping that someone will save him and keep him alive. Who finds him? Ah, what a coincidence. Pharaoh's daughter, right? One of the great coincidences of the Bible, right? But, you know, when you're writing a book about God and the Jewish people, it's easy to say there are no coincidences, right? Well, great coincidence, you know. So Pharaoh's daughter decides to adopt him, and what that means is that Moses is raised in the royal court. And Telushkin speculates, and he's not alone in this, that this makes it more plausible that Moses develops the skills that he needs later on in order to stand up to Pharaoh. Now, I mean, you know, we know there are slave revolts in America, but this is definitely a different situation. You know, so Moses is able to stand up to Pharaoh. Moses knows that he was adopted. It doesn't say so directly, but it seems pretty clear from the text that he knows that he was born one of the slaves from an Israelite family, because later on, you know, it says he went out to his kinfolk. Okay. And the fact that he went out to his kinfolk shows at least some sense that he cares about his people. The other thing is he cares about justice. And how do we know this? Well, there are three other incidents the Bible tells us about Moses' life before he is introduced to God. And Telushkin emphasizes these three and why they are important. I think he is spot on. The first incident is where he attacks an Egyptian overseer who is beating a slave. The second one is where he intervenes in a fight between two Israelites, where he's told, by the way, that what he did to the Egyptian is well known, and he flees to Midian. And the first thing he sees in Midian is there are two groups of shepherds, male and female. By the way, being a shepherd is not a high status job. If you stand around on a hill filled with sheep dung for half an hour, you will know why. Okay? The male shepherds are abusing the female shepherds, won't let them get the water from the wells. Moses comes in to defend the women. Right? Now, why does Moses tell us these three things and only these three events in the early life of Moses? Well, it's clear that Moses cares about right and wrong, about the, you know, people who are powerless at the hands of others. And it's not only because he's originally one of the Israelites, which, you know, he's either been told that or figured it out. The first event, he's defending an Israelite against a non-Israelite. The second event, he's defending one Israelite against another one. And the third one, he's intervening between two groups of people, neither one of which is Israelite. Moses seems to have developed a strong sense of justice, regardless of who is against who. Telushkin mentions the symbolism of the place where Moses meets God at a burning bush. What does this symbolize? In a world where nature was worshipped, God is more powerful than nature. God can burn up the bush and it not be consumed. Right? And why does God appear in a bush? To show, say the rabbis, that no place is devoid of God's presence, even a lowly bush. So the burning bush has become a symbol of the Jewish people. We continue to survive even under fire. So Moses, God meets Moses at the burning bush and says, I'm sending you. I'm sending you to go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go and to free the slaves. And Pharaoh, of course, is going to say, right.
Right.
So, so Moses says, why are you sending me on this errand? Why me, God? Right? God doesn't really give him an answer. He just says, you're my guy. Your brother's going to help you out. I'm going to send your brother Aaron. He'll meet you, and then you'll go together. Right? Aaron can even be your spokesman. Apparently, Moses has some kind of speech impediment. Not clear exactly how that manifests itself, but he doesn't want to go to be the speaker before Pharaoh. God says, fine, your brother will be the spokesman. Right? And then he says, the Israelites are going to ask me, who is this God who sent you? Does this God have a name? Which suggests that they have forgotten all about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which, if you're in a few generations of slavery, you lose any sense of continuity with what came before, right? God gives Moses a great answer, right? He says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, which strictly translated means, I will be what I will be. It's, if you know someone's name, that gives you a certain amount of power, but God's name, is whatever God wants it to be, right? You cannot pin me down with a name. And this is one reason why in Judaism, a lot of sanctity is attached to the name of God or the various names of God that are used, right? The holiest name is the 4-letter Yud-He Vav-He name, which, by the way, is never actually pronounced, not even in the most sacred ceremonies. Used to be, when the temple existed, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would pronounce it once a year on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. But after the temple was destroyed, it was not pronounced. We're not even sure exactly how it would be pronounced, right? So we have lots of other substitutes for God's name. The one that we use most often in prayer, Adonai, Elohim, frequently used in the Torah, frequently used in the prayer book. When we say the Shema, we say Adonai Eloheinu, which is just another form of Elohim, Lord our God, right? Other names like El and El Shaddai, etc., right? You may also, due to this level of reverence for God, you may also have seen the English word God written as G-D.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I see that, I want to blot it out of the book. The English word God is not a name of God. It is a description of what God is. God is God, right? But it is not a name of God, and it doesn't carry that level of sanctity. And you will notice that I do not do that on my note sheets here, right? By the way, this name God tells Moses, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will be what I will be. As Telushkin points out, Moses never uses this name afterwards. Maybe he was really asking about the name not to tell the people what God's name was, but for himself. And so he gets an answer that he uses for himself. Okay? One possible lesson from this is that a true experience of God's presence can never be completely explained to anyone else. it is always at least partly particular and private for that person. Now, my academic field is in Jewish mysticism, and some of you know that I edited a book that was published 5 years ago, a reader in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. And one of the reasons why I got into the study of this was because over the years of my rabbinate, people would come to me and tell me about their own different mystical experiences of various kinds, where they felt a sense of nearness to God's presence, etc. And frequently, when people would tell me these stories, they would say, "Rabbi, am I crazy?" Now, here's a hint. If you ever want to be a rabbi, never answer that question yes. Right? I mean, I could have said yes, but they have medicines for that these days. Right? But, you know, people trust the rabbi to ask a question like that, knowing that the rabbi is not going to say, "Yes, you're crazy." And in fact, you know, I realized that there's a certain normalness about many of these kinds of experiences, because so many people came to me with these experiences. And I said, I also had an experience like that once upon a time. And so maybe it's something that's common to a lot of people. Maybe this was an experience of that nature for Moses. Someone asked the question, what does the name El Shaddai mean? It's a good question. El is just a name for God. Shaddai means the Almighty. So El Shaddai, God Almighty. It's also suggested that that is kind of a conglomeration of two Hebrew words, the God who is Dai, who is enough. You know the song Dayenu, if you've been to a Passover Seder, right? Dayenu means it would have been enough for us, right? Dai means enough. You know, my wife tells this story. Before she really knew that much Hebrew, she was visiting in a household of some Israelis, and the mother would, the kids were kind of acting out a little bit, and the mother would say, "Die, die." And Toby thought she was actually telling the children they should die. And then she realized, no, that wasn't it. Dayen, right? It's enough. That's what she was telling her kids. But Shaddai could be the God who is enough, who is sufficient for everything that we have. Okay? More likely, it comes from this sense of, God who is all powerful, who is almighty, right? Even if God is not necessarily all powerful. Okay. So Moses goes to Egypt and he says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go that they may worship me." Right? Now, that's a very interesting verse. Everyone remembers the first part of it. Most people don't remember the second part, right? Which Touloushkin also mentions. The point is, you can't serve God if you're serving someone or something else, right? And Pharaoh says, "Are you kidding?" Right? And so there come a series of 10 plagues, right? And the plagues show God's power over what is worshipped in Egypt. Like, for instance, the Nile River was an object of worship. And these things also punish the Egyptians for what they did to the slaves, right? Not everybody, mistreated their slaves, but as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said about you know, modern America, as well as ancient Egypt, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And so the first plague, the Nile turns to blood. It's a symbol that Egypt is a bloody regime, right? Think of all the other mothers besides Moses' mother who might have put their sons in a little raft and sent them down the river, and then they didn't get picked up, or the raft turned over and the babies were drowned. Okay? So maybe this blood in the Nile is something that corresponds to the death of the Hebrew babies. Never mind the 10th plague, which is the outright killing of the firstborn Egyptian sons. Right? And what happens in the process of these plagues? Very interesting. It says after when it got to the last 5 plagues, and they got worse, of course, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Right? Telushkin says about this, it actually gives Pharaoh the choice to respond out of something other than terror. Right? Like, oh, God is punishing us for what we did. Maybe I should rethink this. My answer to this is a little bit different from his. I think this is not a fact that God actually hardened Pharaoh's heart. It is a description of something that is a built-in process. Power is like an addiction. The Pharaoh may want to give in, but he's addicted to power. He can't give in. He can't let go. And even though it took the 10 plagues to get Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, there is a lot of unfair suffering to the Egyptians. To take a similar example, a very extreme one, we understand today that there were some good Germans during the Second World War. When Germany was bombed and devastated in the last years of the war, the good people suffered also. Of course, not many of us would cry about that, but it's still true. And God cries when the innocent suffer. Hence, the custom of taking out 10 drops of wine from our cups at the celebration of the Passover Seder. And then the same thing happens at the crossing of the sea. God sends this huge wind to push the sea apart. Pharaoh, by the way, has had a change of heart. He regrets letting the slaves go, sends his army after them, and the sea comes back on them as the wind subsides and the army drowns. So the legend says the angels were singing in celebration. God says, my children are drowning and you're celebrating. This leads to the development of another custom that on Jewish holidays at the morning service, we add a group of psalms of praise, Hallel, right? A prayer called Hallel made up of these psalms. On the last 6 days of Passover, when we say the Hallel, we leave out some of it, as if to say our celebration can't be complete if it involved human suffering. Interestingly, the Israelites do sing and celebrate. The song recorded in chapter 15 of Exodus is believed to be one of the earliest written parts of Scripture. And God doesn't criticize them for this, maybe because when slaves are miraculously freed, it is human nature for them to say, hooray, we're free, they're dead, right? But we who are the physical and the spiritual descendants of those Israelites, and we include the song in Exodus 15 in every single morning service, in the preliminary prayers, every day. We have to know that God also cares about the suffering of others, even if they were the Egyptian soldiers, and certainly the suffering of every family in Egypt who lost their firstborn sons. So the lesson from this is celebrate the Exodus, but know that God cares about the suffering of all people. All right, we're at the end of our time. I don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you all very much. And please send me whatever questions you might have. We were a little light on questions this week, so feel free to send them all. Make up for that next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night,
Good night,
everybody.
See
everyone.
you.